All right, welcome to Till Talks with Chris White, where we talk TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, and all advanced cell and gene therapies, both with patients and caregivers, along with industry leaders. Let's get going. As a reminder, I am not a medical professional or medical expert. I am only a professional and expert on my story and my experience. If you are needing or seeking medical advice or assistance, please reach out to your care team. All right, my next guest on Till Talks fought lymphoma for 12 years before finally being able to enroll in a clinical trial for CAR-T therapy. She had been on multiple clinical trials prior to this, and it saved her life. That was 7 years ago, and please give it up for Laurie Adami. Thank you for joining Till Talks. I'm so glad you're on today, Laurie. Give us the 101 about yourself and your diagnosis and your treatment, the elevator pitch.
Okay, so I grew up in the Northeast and moved out to California to Los Angeles when I was 24 years old to join a software company. It was a startup. And 14 years later, I became president of the company when the founder retired. So in 1998, I became president of the company. That same year, I got married at the age of 38. And at the age of 40, I had my first son, my only son, I should say, my only child, my son, August. And not long after, when he was about 3 years old, I began to experience all kinds of weird health stuff and, went to various doctors and got kind of the usual dismissal from doctors, basically minimizing my concerns. When I'd raised the issue, I was concerned I might have lymphoma. I heard that I saw the rolling eyes and got what makes you think you have lymphoma? And why in the world you don't have lymphoma? You just have allergies or whatever. So I was dismissed for almost 3 years, and my symptoms, I had started to get regular and frequent sinus infections, and I had also developed a dry eye. I had been a contact lens wearer for over 30 years, and suddenly my eye was so dry I couldn't wear my contact lenses, and I was then dismissed as being an older woman. I was at this point 43. It was suggested that this might be hormone issues. I also had extreme fatigue, to which another doctor rolled his eyes and said, "Look, Lori, you're running a company with over 100 employees. You're traveling domestically and internationally at least a week a month. You're running a household. You have a small child at home." He said, "I'm just exhausted listening to you." But in my heart, I knew this was a different kind of exhaustion. My mother-in-law would come over and babysit for my son, and I would just go sit on a park bench somewhere because I was so exhausted. Just get a break and just sit. I mean, I just was completely exhausted. And so this carried on until I finally got referred to an internist who was sort of known for doing diagnostics on patients who had sort of odd combinations of symptoms. And what he said to me, he said, "Lori, your body is not walled off. You don't have one section of your body that doesn't talk to another section. Everything's your body and it's all integrated. So the fact that you're getting this dry eye, the fact that you're getting frequent sinus infections, very likely that's in some way related." And, I told him that it had been suggested that I may have allergies. So of course I went and got tested for allergies and I didn't have any. So, there were clear things that had happened and I'd followed through on. And, but regardless, these doctors said, "Well, even though you didn't test, we should treat you like you have allergies," which was crazy. So anyway, I also had felt something in my abdomen. It was like a lump. And the one doctor many doctors had suggested it was a hernia. "Well, that's just a hernia. Don't worry about it. You probably got it when you had your baby, blah, blah, blah." And so when I went to this new diagnostician, he did an examination. He felt this lump I'd felt in my abdomen. He said, "Yeah, it feels like a hernia." And then I also had a lump in my neck that, doctors had said, "Well, it's because you had a sinus infection and you can have an enlarged lymph node from a sinus infection for years. Don't worry about it. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this diagnostician took my whole history, looked at all the tests that had been done on me, felt this thing in my abdomen, said, yeah, it's probably a hernia. But he said, Laurie, we don't guess about this stuff. That's why we have CT machines. So while I was sitting there in his office, he called a hernia specialist and explained what was going on. And the hernia specialist said, yeah, I can fit you in right away. I go in. Also, I had felt and it had been noticed that I had some nodes on my thyroid. They had one of the ENTs had done a CT scan and I had, I don't know if they call it goiter or what they call it. So, of course, I was really worried that I might have thyroid cancer. And in hindsight, I think if only it had been thyroid cancer, it might have been easier than what I ended up being diagnosed with. But anyway, the doctor decided that would go in for a CT scan of this hernia in my abdomen. At the same time, the facility would do biopsies on my thyroid. So I was told, well, when you go in for your CT scan, you won't need any contrast. It'll just be straightforward. It's a hernia. It's likely a hernia. I think they called it a Spigelian hernia or something. And he said, you won't need contrast. They'll be able to get good images and blah, blah, blah. So I had family coming out for Easter. My brother was coming in from Boston with my mom. My dad had passed away. My mom had dementia, so my brother was going to fly out with her and stay with us for the Easter weekend. Anyway, just before they came into town, I went to the center where I was going to get this biopsy and the scan. So they first do the scan, and I think, okay, that's done. That was easy. And, no contrast, no nothing. So then, I go in to get the nodule biopsied. And as I'm laying there on the table, I see this person walk in with a bottle that was white. Actually, I think it was 2 bottles. And she said, Laurie, you're going to need to drink this and then we need to reimage you. And I said, well, no, that's not what my doctor said, trying to, I don't know what. I didn't want to drink this gunk. So she said, well, we didn't get very clear images. So we need to have you drink this, come back into the scanning machine. So anyway, they do the biopsies and then, I drink the stuff and I wait and then I go in and they image me. And then they said, don't put your clothes on yet because we want to get a look at the images. So I waited and she comes back in and she says, okay, now we have to do an injection of a tracer because we're still not getting good images. And I'm sitting there like, this doesn't sound very good. I think I might have a problem. So anyway, they do they inject me and then I get the hot flashes, which is the first time I'd ever experienced that, from the injections. And they do more images and then they tell me, okay, you're good to go home and you'll hear from your doctor. So I think I went to the airport and picked up my brother and my mom. And then I get a call from the hernia doctor's office saying I needed to come in right away. And I said, well, I can. I've got family here, and then I've got to go out of town. I was leaving on Monday. My company, we were holding our client seminars in Chicago and New York. And of course, it was very important that I had to go to these events because I was the keynote speaker deliverer and whatnot. And so I said, well, I'll have to come and see you after the trip. And so the assistant said, okay, that's fine, but, come in as soon as you get back. So I didn't really think much of it. I thought he was just going to tell me, yeah, you have a hernia and you need to have surgery to repair it, right? So then it's Friday, Good Friday, and I get a call from my internist office saying, Laurie, you have to come in today. So I'm thinking, okay, I better go in. And I went in alone. I wanted my brother to stay at home with my mom because she had dementia and we were concerned that she could wander off being home alone. So I went into the doctor by myself and he comes in to see me and he says, I have bad news. He said, you have a 5-inch tumor in your abdomen. There could be either a mesenchymal tumor, which will be fatal within 2 to 3 months. There's no treatment or you have lymphoma. And oh, by the way, on the CT scan, we picked up images of your lungs and you have a spot in your lung. So you may also have lung cancer. So I'm sitting there in complete shock. He said, I called an oncologist's office and I have you set up for an appointment on Tuesday to go see an oncologist. I'm referring you to a female because I think you'd appreciate seeing a woman doctor. So I'm in shock and I say, well, I can't go in because I have to go. I'm leaving on Monday. I'm going to my conferences in Chicago, New York. And he's just kind of looking at me like, she's crazy. What? But I was just in shock. So I said, but as soon as I come back, I'll go see the oncologist. So we're talking, and suddenly it hits me. Yeah, I'm not going on my business trip. I need to go to the oncologist. Like, I didn't even know what an I barely knew what an oncologist was.
So, can I ask, so from your first symptom to this point in time, how long was this from first symptom to hearing that the actual
It
news
was
for the
like
first
almost
time that,
3
yes,
it was
this is
almost
cancer?
3 years. So my son was still in preschool when I started to experience these weird symptoms, and he was now in kindergarten when I found out I had cancer. And so then, he sends me home. I am driving home, calling one of my assistants saying, "I am gonna have to cancel. You're gonna have to cancel me. You're gonna have to find somebody to do my talks," which was fine, was no big deal. But it appears I have some type of terrible cancer, and I might actually have 2 types of cancer. And of course, I was stunned, like, about my lungs. I never smoked. I never smoked cigarettes or
Yeah,
smoked
like,
pot. But now I know there's tons of people that get lung cancer that never ever smoked. I didn't know that at the time. So anyway, so I go home for Easter weekend. My in-laws are all coming over for Easter dinner. My brother and my mom are there, and I slid into this horrible state of depression, just shock. It was like a bomb went off in my head, and I didn't know the first thing about what the hell to do. Nobody does. I mean, I'm giving a talk. I gave a talk last year, and I 2,000 people in the room, and I said, "Okay, how many people out in the room think you're going to get diagnosed with cancer?" And not a single hand went up because nobody ever expects.
you don't
Yeah,
expect
so of
that.
course you have no idea what to do. You immediately go to the worst place. I had a girlfriend in high school whose mother had ovarian cancer. And I remember going over to my girlfriend's house and hearing her mom vomiting in the bathroom because she was so sick from the chemo. And then her mom died when we were still in high school. And so I had just terrible recollections, as well as my dad had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the week of 9/11. And, he lived a year and a half after treatment, but, it was one of those terrible stories. And of course, he was in the Boston area and I was in California. So I wasn't there as a witness as he went through his radiation and his chemo and whatnot. I knew enough. It
Yeah.
was awful. So anyway, so I went right to that dark, dark, dark place. And kind of went into a state of shock, denial, depression. I couldn't eat. Within a week, I'd lost, 10 pounds, just beside myself. So I was set up to go on the Tuesday, to meet with the oncologist and to get the PET scan. She said the result would come back within a day or two. My husband and I went in, and I remember we had some time to kill, and we were sitting in a park in Beverly Hills, and I was looking at these people, and I saw the sanitation people emptying the trash. And I remember thinking, I just want to be them. I don't want to be me anymore. I just want to trade with anyone. 'Cause I just cou I mean, I was shocked, my body had let me down. I'm just looking at myself like, "What did I ever do to deserve a 5-inch tumor in my abdomen and lung cancer?" And
And they're not giving you causes as to why or how this
yeah,
could happen. It's just, this is what
it's what
is,
it is, and
right?
we didn't even know what it was. On the Friday after I got the news, I called my OBGYN, who I'd been with years. I was an older mom when I got pregnant, and he took care of me. And he was, a sweet guy. I called and left a message to page him, and he called me, and he said, "Laurie, come into the office. I wanna ultrasound you." So I remember I went in, I think it was Saturday afternoon, and nobody was there. And
Yeah, it's they're not even
they're not
open.
open.
He was getting you,
But my
yeah.
OBGYN said, "Come on in. I'm gonna take a look at it and see if I can get any sense of what's going on." So he speculated that he said it was very unlikely it was a mesenchymal tumor because he had a sense of what that would look like and how invasive that could be into other organs and whatnot. And so he felt pretty strongly that what I was dealing with was probably non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So anyway, I met these people along the way who were just angels, like him showing up on his Saturday afternoon to check a patient,
That means
I know,
everything
and
to
for him to actually the ultrasound machine.
that's like a true heart of, someone in the medical field that actually gives a
Yeah,
shit,
yeah,
and
exactly.
that goes miles.
Exactly, exactly. And, I had those encounters during my journey, which were very meaningful. And anyway, going on to after that, I go in on Tuesday, have to do the PET CT scan. So, they inject you full of this stuff and then you have to sit there on a they told me, yeah, they put me in this recliner and they said, "Okay, Lori, just relax." And I'm like, "Are you crazy? How do I relax? I just found out I have a tumor that's bigger than a grapefruit and all this other stuff going on." And, you know, yeah, I don't think relaxation is gonna be part of my next hour. Anyway, they took me in the CTs or they took me in for the PET CT, and I was freaked out. I was crying, I was upset, I was depressed, I was thinking I was gonna die, my son wasn't gonna have a mom, he was only in kindergarten, and this woman who was the tech on the PET CT machine, oh my goodness, she was wonderful. Her name was Sandra, and she had had breast cancer and actually lost her eye because of her cancer and how it spread. And she was so wonderful. She said, "Lori, we have so many patients here with non-Hodgkin's. There's good treatments." And so she was real. And then I realized how important it was that I met other people who had cancer because she actually understood the fears, the panic, the children issue, all of it. So that's when I realized, okay, I need to make sure people with cancer are part of my journey because nobody else gets.
Yeah.
And immediately people are saying, "Oh, well, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade." And unbelievably, one person said to me, I won't say who that person was, but when I said, "I'm so worried that I'm going to die and Gus isn't going to have a mom," this person actually suggested to me, "Don't worry, kids lose their parents all the time and they're just fine."
Probably says the person that doesn't have a
You
child,
got it.
or, or has never had a terminal diagnosis or a cancer
This is the
diagnosis.
kind of stuff we deal with, and it makes it really, really hard. Anyway, so I got the scan. I'd had to fast before, so I remember we stopped
Yeah.
restaurant in Beverly Hills on the way home for lunch after the imaging. And then on Thursday morning, the oncologist was going to call me. If she got the result Wednesday, she'd call me, but she said likely it won't be till Thursday and I'll give you a call. So we're waiting by the phone. She said she was going to call me at 11. And of course, 11 o'clock passed. So I'm, of course, convinced that she's got terrible news and she doesn't want to call me, which of course wasn't true. She probably just had a patient appointment and ran late. Anyway,
Yeah.
she calls me and she says, "Well, I don't have good news. You have stage 4 cancer. It appears with the presentation to be non-Hodgkin lymphoma, but of course we won't know that for sure until we biopsy it. But the good news is the spot in your lung is very likely the same disease.
Just metastasized
This is not
from.
secondary. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma can go anywhere." She said, "Your dry eye is because you have a tumor in your tear duct." So much for hormones, all these doctors dismissing me saying it was hormones. I actually had a tumor in my adrenal gland, which was completely blocking the gland.
Yeah.
No teardrops were getting into that eye, so of course it was dried out. And the thing in my neck lit up on the PET scan, so that was also the tumor that had metastasized from this mother lode in my abdomen, which was huge, very bulky.
Was it a lymph node that had just got, full of.
Yeah, but my
Yeah.
cancer was actually it was really interesting because I had cancer in my salivary, glands. I had cancer in my parotid gland. I had cancer in all kinds of glands. At one point, I actually had it on the top of my skull. So I had what's called extranodal disease, which is an unusual presentation. It doesn't happen all that common, but it does. So that was actually, it was good that it was all the same thing. But I said, well, can I get surgery where they just remove this? I assume I can't since it's everywhere. She said, "You can't." That's right. There'd be no point in doing that. And I said, "What about radiation?" She said, "Again, no point. I can't radiate your entire body." So
Was anybody explaining that, you have a hematologic cancer and that's different to a solid tumor and how it travels throughout your body and how you
they, no,
how
I mean,
no,
a
none of
little
that?
bit, but I don't know how much I was hearing, but my husband was with me and yeah, he was taking me. and whatnot. But
Gotcha.
but the point was that I needed systemic treatment, which meant I needed
Yes.
chemotherapy and a combination with a new monoclonal antibody or newer called Rituxan. And that, the expectation, this was not, she thought it was likely follicular. There's over 100 types of lymphoma.
Mhm.
And at the time when I was diagnosed, there were 20 that had been identified. But now, due to genetic, and looking at targets and whatnot, there's over 100 types now. So, she had to set up a biopsy to biopsy the largest tumor, which was the tumor in my abdomen. And fortunately, they could do a laparoscopy, but I'd have to stay in the hospital overnight. So, anyway, and then she said, once they get that biopsy, it's going to take probably 8 days to get the diagnosis because they have to use all these different stains and it grows.
Yeah.
And depending on what grows, and they branch out in a different direction. And yeah,
Culture
yeah.
it
So it's
and
very, very
yeah.
complicated. But she said, we'll get that going. She said, it's the two most common types of non Hodgkins are a diffuse large B cell, which is a very aggressive tumor, which will typically double in a week, the size of tumors. So she said, I'm guessing that's probably not what you have because you've been reporting symptoms for 3 years. And if it was diffuse large B cell, I mean, you would be dead. If you hadn't treated it, because the tumors grow so aggressively. And also, oftentimes, you have night sweats, you have itchy skin, you have all the stuff which I hadn't had. So she said, I'm guessing it's follicular, non Hodgkin, which the diffuse large B cell, the good news about the aggressive one, it's highly curable. So typically around 90% of patients are cured with the first treatment, which is our job. She said with follicular, it's more like a chronic condition. You treat it, maybe it goes away for 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe you never see it again, but typically it returns. And then we have to do a stem cell transplant, usually using your own stem cells. So she said, assuming it's follicular and we get you into complete remission, at that point we would harvest your stem cells and we would put them in the bank in the freezer in case you need them. And she said, I'm going to recommend that if it is follicular, that I'll refer you out to City of Hope, which has been doing transplants since the mid 70s. And I'll refer you to Dr. Foreman, who's the head of transplant at City of Hope. So you'll see him for a second opinion, get arranged to get your stem cells harvested and saved so that if you need it, that's what we'll do. Anyway, so she kind of set up that as sort of the expectation. And I said, well, should I go get second opinions at this point? She said, oh, absolutely, but don't go yet. Let's wait until we confirm your diagnosis. And once we do that, then you can hear what these doctors suggest. So that was kind of where I was at that point in time. She told me, assuming it's follicular, she said, yeah, you're obviously having symptoms of this disease. So we can't, some patients with follicular, they can just be what they say call watch and wait. So they just go into sort of a monitoring process where every month they go in for labs, every 3 months they go get scans, see if the disease is threatening organs. But she said, you're symptomatic and you have bulky disease. We need to treat you right away. So I went in for the biopsy. They cultured it. They just did a fine needle biopsy. They did all the cultures and whatnot. And it came back as follicular. So at that point, I went and got an opinion at three other big. I was really lucky to be in LA because we have a lot of really great cancer centers. NCI does not.
UCLA, Cedar Sinai, I mean, you got yeah, there's a lot going on
USC,
down there.
Your Hope. So I didn't even have to get on a plane to go anywhere else. So I went on the rounds. My husband came with me for second opinions. I actually, at that point, went out to City of Hope to see the head of transplant. And so they all said the same thing. You have to do our job because that's all we have. You could maybe just do Rituxan or you could do our chop without the adriamycin, which was called RCVP.
And remind me again what year
This is 2006. Yep.
2000? Okay.
So my son is, still in kindergarten. And of course, then we're dealing with knowing that it's systemic treatment. It's chemo, which means my hair is going to fall out. So we can't exactly hide it from my son. he's gonna go to
Yeah.
school and say, "Oh, my mommy's hair fell out," and some of his classmates are gonna say, "Yeah, that happened to my grandma, and she died. It was cancer," you know? So we had to get in front of that. So we had to deal with all of that, which was challenging, you know? And anyway, so when I went out to this transplant facility, the doctor questioned diagnosis. He said, "You know, these fine needle biopsies often don't get enough of the tumor. So I really think to be cautious, even though the treatment will be the same, I think to be cautious because it was the only treatment they had back in 2006, which is really unbelievable." He said, "I think to be on the safe side, you should get an excisional biopsy where they actually go in and surgically take a piece of this tumor in your abdomen. It'll be like the size of the end of your thumb, but then we'll get more tissue. We can just confirm because it's just we just need to know for sure." So I went back. I had the biopsy done at Cedars, and it was an overnight, and it was very traumatic because my son didn't know what was going on. We hadn't told him anything at that point, other than he knew I'd been sick. I kept getting sinus infections. I felt crappy. So he knew all of that,
Yeah.
but my husband came in that night after the procedure with my son, and my son crawled into bed with me and said, "Daddy, I'm staying with mommy. I'm not going home with you. I can't leave mommy by herself in the hospital." And my husband basically had to, like, drag him out of the bed. So just seeing that, it was all so it was
Heartbreaking.
heartbreaking. Of course, when they got home, my husband and son called me because when they left, my husband took my son out for dinner, and then they went for ice cream, and he was fine by the time he got home.
Trying to soften the
Yeah,
blow.
so then he called to let me know, he's okay." Anyway, I was just held overnight for one night and then, went home and then had to wait another week and a half, and the waiting was really the hardest part, of all of it, just this not knowing and feeling like this cancer was out of control in my body and, all of that. So
The
the
unknown.
unknown, the fear of the unknown, and even though all 4 doctors I consulted with had said the same thing, that I needed R-CHOP, one of the doctors that I saw, I won't name the institution that he was at, but I said, "So what are the statistics?" This was before I understood I should ignore the statistics, that I was 100%, I was 0. I was either alive or I was dead. There was no 50% of anything. So he said, "Well, I give you a 50% chance you'll be alive in 2 years." And I lost it. And he said, "Why are you so upset? 2 years is a long time." I said, "Excuse me? I'm 46. I'm not 86. My son is in kindergarten. Do you think he'll be okay? He loses his mom when he's 2 in 2nd grade." And I said, "Yeah, I am leaving
Yeah.
this room. I want you to have nothing to do with my care. If you have that pessimistic an outlook, I'll see you later."
Yeah. That attitude has no room
It's
in
a
the yeah.
self-fulfilling prophecy. So, anyway, I was really pissed and upset, and, I just left, and I just said, "Yeah, I'm not seeing him." The statistics well, anyway, so confirmation was that it was follicular lymphoma. It was stage 4. They'd done bone marrow biopsies, which is no walk in the park, without anesthesia because they wanted to do it right away, which meant they couldn't book a hospital room and book anesthesiologists, and so those were the first bilateral bone marrow biopsies in the doctor's office, and during the course of my cancer journey, I had a total of 15 of them, and only one
Oh my
went
god.
under sedation, because every
That's
I did, you
insane.
had to do that, and then when I was in trials, they wanted to test it again after N number of months. So, anyway,
Right.
so back to the diagnosis. They had the diagnosis, and I was to start treatment right away. Once it was confirmed as follicular, it was really incredible because they said, "You've had cancer." Given the size of these tumors and the fact that these tumors grow relatively slowly with follicular, considered a more indolent, slow growing type of disease, they thought I had it for at least 5 years, if not 10 years, which means very likely I
Damn.
had it when I was pregnant with my son. And so then I began to recognize that it was really kind of great I didn't learn about it sooner because that may have required, I mean, I can't even imagine, like, who knows if I had been diagnosed. I mean, if I'd been diagnosed before I got pregnant with my son, because my son was only 6 at my diagnosis, I may never have had him because the chemo can make you sterile. So,
Yep.
so I kind of began to feel like, okay, kinda not so bad. It took a long time to get diagnosed, and once I had that diagnosis, I wrote that doctor, that ENT, who rolled his eyes
Mhm.
at me and my husband and said, "You don't have lymphoma, you have allergies." It was one of those classic conversations, and I had a witness who was my husband to this conversation, and I wrote a letter to this doctor saying, "I don't know, I think you probably remember me. I was this woman who came in with long blonde hair. My husband was with me because I wanted to make sure he knew I had a witness. He said, "You
Yep.
poo-poo, you dismissed me. You were insulting. You rolled your eyes like I was a hypochondriac." Well, I thought you might like to know I actually have stage 4 non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So I really hope you were of no help to me, but I really hope next time some woman comes in, you don't just dismiss her. And he was kind of misogynist. I mean, it was really creepy. He was a creepy guy. I said, thank goodness my husband. He said, "I hope you'll listen to them." And of course, he's a chicken. I never heard from him. Although my husband kind of was entertained because he wondered how long it took this doctor to call up this malpractice attorney.
Yeah, where's legal at? Should I reply? How do I reply? Like, he probably felt like an
Oh, I
idiot.
know, I know.
I mean,
And
shit.
I sent the letter registered mail, so I knew he'd get it. And, I just couldn't resist yanking his chain. I never would've sued him. I'm not that type of person, but
No,
he
but
needed a little
still,
bit of a
you rightfully so
he
deserve
was
to write
very,
that letter.
very I mean, with his ego, it was hard for me to fit in the examining room because his ego was humongous. Anyway, that was my
Anyways, yeah, fast forward.
"Well, okay, you were wrong, Doctor Brilliant." He said to me, "Well, how did you find out about lymphoma and that this" I said, "I just Googled it." "Oh, Doctor Google." Well, I was in medical school, and then I did residency, and then I did fellowship, and blah, blah, blah. "What, you go on Doctor" well, it turns out Doctor Google was right, and he was wrong.
Yeah, you can compare and contrast through Doctor Google, you know what I mean? Like, instead of just getting one voice and opinion saying, "Okay, I'm right," nobody else could be,
So moving forward, I made the decision to work with the oncologist that had diagnosed me. It was in an independent oncology practice that has since been bought back by Cedars. But my original diagnostician, who had gotten me the imaging and whatnot that figured out I had cancer, had suggested that their patient care was superb to any of the big cancer hospitals. So I figured I'd start there and, maybe I would be one and done. I'd get treatment and have a long remission. So we began treatment, which was Rituxan and then these 3 chemo agents, including adriamycin, which is known to be hard on a patient's heart. But they had, by this point, 2006, they had reduced the doses they used to give to people. And so the risk of heart damage was less. And since what my disease was so big and so bulky and I was symptomatic, they really wanted to go at it with all the guns, if you will. So I was to have 6 cycles. After my 3rd cycle, I was to be imaged to see if it was working. And so I started chemo. And, of course, you have side effects. Everything has side effects, no matter what you told me, what they tell you. And it was cute because I was really worried I was going to have to start smoking pot. I never wanted to get anything in my lungs. My parents were super
but you can eat it.
yeah, but I never wanted to do any of that stuff. My parents have been really, really anti-tobacco, anti-smoking, and you never wanna put anything in your lungs and, all that, and so I'd ask the oncologist, "Am I gonna have to start smoking pot or taking eating it?" And she's like, "No, we have great nausea meds." And she said it was interesting. She said, "When you were pregnant with your son, did you ever have morning sickness?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, never, not once." And she said, "It's interesting because they've done studies now that women who didn't have morning sickness when they were pregnant usually don't have nausea going through chemo. There's like a chemical you either have or you don't have that makes you nauseous." So that was really interesting. It turned out I prophylactically would take anti-seizure. I'm sorry, not anti-seizure. I would prophylactically take
Doesn't answer.
anti-nausea meds. And so all through my treatment, I never had a single experience with nausea, which is great because I could keep my weight on. A lot of people lose weight and it weakens you. So I really wanted to keep my weight on. And I remember the nurses would weigh me and they're like, "Oh my gosh, Laura, you gained a pound. How is this possible?" I said, "Well, I discovered pretzels and ginger ale." very comforting, and so that's what I did.
Yeah, eat what you
Eat what you
can.
can, and I remember with that diagnostician, he had put me on he wanted me to limit certain things in my diet. He had done this muscle testing,
Right.
which I don't know if I even believe in muscle testing, but suggested I had sensitivities to certain things, so he wanted me to limit carbs, limit all this stuff, and I remember when I talked to him after my diagnosis, he said, "Lori," he said, "forget that diet. If you wanna eat chocolate chip cookies for breakfast, eat chocolate chip cookies for breakfast. You need to keep your weight on. You need to be strong. After you get through this, we can always resume the diet." And he had all these supplements he wanted me to do and whatnot. Anyway, so I started the treatment. And after the third cycle, it was a cycle every 3 weeks. After the third cycle, I had a PET CT to check and see if it was working. The oncologist called me the next day. She said, "Great news, Lori. Your cancer's already gone after 3 cycles. So this is really promising. We're going to do the last 3 cycles because that's the protocol, and then we'll image you. And then, but this is really great news that you're having, because usually if somebody's clean after the first 3 cycles, they will have complete remission at the end, and typically a sustained complete remission." So we were all really excited and encouraged. I'd gone out on leave from work, so I was on a short-term leave. And that ended up working out. I assigned 2 of my sort of senior executives to co-manage the business in my absence so I could really focus on my health. So finished the last 3 cycles, and we're now my last chemo was 9/11 of 2006, and at that point, after 6 cycles, I had a scan, and I was confirmed to be in complete remission, so I was immediately chomping at the bit to go back to work and resume my life of normalcy. I don't really think my life was normal. I was traveling too much and I had way too much stress. But anyway, I wanted to go back to being a normal person again. And the oncologist said, "Laura, you can't go back to work yet. You have to wait. You got to wait. Okay, tell me you'll wait till after Thanksgiving because I want your immune system to recover. You've just gone through a really brutal treatment. I don't want you traveling yet because you could catch a bug, that can set you back. So I'll okay you to go back after Thanksgiving." Of course, I was already doing emails from home and the rest of it, but I didn't go back to work. And so I started back at work. I started traveling right away. My oncologist said, "Okay, Laura, I just want you to wear a mask on the plane, and I want you to bring hand sanitizer, and I want you to bring wipes, and I want you to wipe down the tray table and the airplane seats." The plane, we know after 9/11, there was no cleaning of planes and whatnot. So I just want you to take those precautions. But yeah, I'll clear you. So I started traveling to London again and to New York and Boston and whatever. And we were going to do maintenance. We started to do maintenance for Tucson because there was a feeling that if I still got maintenance infusion of the monoclonal antibody, it would keep the disease in remission. So I started doing that. And then in January, so just 4 months after I was declared in complete remission, she said, "I just want to do an imaging and see what's going on." So she images me and she calls me the next day, "You've got uptake in your lungs again." So she said it could be inflammatory. Maybe have you had any? I hadn't had a cold, I hadn't had anything. She said, "Well, it could still be inflammatory, but I want you to go see a pulmonologist and just kind of, you know, get it a little checked out further." But the only thing you could really do at that point was to biopsy, and getting a lung biopsy is pretty invasive. They have to break your ribs, and it's not like biopsying a lymph node sticking out of my neck. So we decided just to watch and wait. Of course, my stomach started to sink. My cancer could be already coming back when everybody thought, "Oh wow, I hit the ball out of the park and I was going to be in a good remission." Anyway, the disease just kept progressing. So every quarter I would go in and check it. And so I just watched and waited for about a year. Then it was very clear. This was in 2008. The disease was getting bulky again. It was coming back in my abdomen. It was like the same presentation. But I figured the longer I could wait, maybe the more options I would have. So I started to consult to get opinions on what I should do next. And everybody was saying auto stem cell transplant. So after I got in remission in 2006, or we thought, which turns out I was never in molecular full remission, We just couldn't see it yet. So they had harvested my stem cells and put them in the bank so I could do an auto transplant. Now, to do an auto transplant, I would have to get an even more brutal chemotherapy to get me in remission. At that point, I would be hospitalized because I would have no immune system. And then, they would inject me, reinfuse my stem cells into me with the hope that they would be clean and I could get a long term remission. So everybody's telling me auto transplant, everybody. So I start to research auto transplant. I already had a bit, so I already kind of knew what to expect. And the patient was usually in the hospital for a month, which was not an insignificant barrier to overcome since I had a little kid at home who is now in first grade. And so I started to research auto transplant for follicular. And what I discovered was that 50% of patients after auto transplant relapsed in their first year. And so then I've undergone a second wicked chemotherapy. If you had relapsed right away after R-CHOP, your odds were even worse. So at that point, I thought, I got to find a clinical trial. So I started researching. And at that point in time, this is 2007, 2008, all I had to use was clinicaltrials.gov, which is a piece of garbage. Oh, the stuff in there isn't even okayed by the FDA. So there's lots of false stuff in there. It's not updated. So there might be a trial that says it's recruiting and it's already been closed down, either because of failure. I mean, now, 19 years later after my diagnosis, there are nonprofits who will help you find legitimate trials. And it
Hmm.
was just cancer. It was clinicaltrials.gov. I'd also been fundraising for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And so I reached out to them. And so I had funded I was funding because I'd had big fundraisers where I was raising $50,000. Um, and so I could actually fund individual researchers. I was doing the Light the Night walks with Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. So I kind of had ends. I actually thought, well, maybe I can fundraise and fund a researcher who finds something to get rid of my cancer.
Specifically for you,
I
right?
started doing fundraisers kind of selfishly. They said, we don't care. You're raising money. It's good. And if you raised 50 or higher with Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, you can actually direct funds to a specific researcher that was being funded by LLS. And so that gave me great entree to different researchers. And so I funded a researcher at Mayo. I funded a researcher at Stanford. And so I was able to consult with them. I was going back to Boston to see my family that summer. So I went in to see the head of follicular at Dana-Farber. When I was back to see what he had, he said, I'll go anywhere, right? And he said, Laurie, you're in LA. You have tons of trials in LA. And we're not going to have, I don't have anything right now that's not something you could get in LA. So I started to again make the rounds. And I was in consult with this head of transplant at City of Hope. And he was not happy I didn't want to transplant. He said, Laurie, that's the only thing we can do. And I said, I said, if you told me there was a 75% chance I could get it, I'd do it. That's good. But at under 50, probably 25% chance given I had relapsed after our child. I said, but the bigger problem for me, I figured out an angle. I said, the bigger problem for me is I can't go in the hospital for a month. I have a young son at home. My husband has his own business. I mean, if you said there was a good chance I'd get in remission, I'd get one of my siblings to come out from New England to take my place at home and get my kid to school and all that stuff. But with this odds, I just can't do it. So he said, okay, I'm going to see if I can find you a trial. So he found me a trial of an HDAC inhibitor that had been approved for T cell lymphoma, which was different than what I had. It was B cell lymphoma, but it had been approved for T cell lymphoma and they were trying it on B cell CO. So I agreed I would move forward. So that was my second line of treatment, which was a pill. It was really not easy. It was really hard. I felt worse than I did going in chemo. I mean, it was rough. I couldn't even get out of bed on this drug. So anyway, but I thought, you know what? Better I'm home in bed. I can get out of bed. I can take my kid to school. I can pick him up. I don't have to be in a hospital to do this. And it seemed to clip off the growth, of the cancer. And then it seemed like I was stable for a bit. And then we had a good scan result. Um, so now I'm in 2008, at the end of 2008. I remember my oncologist came in and said, "Your latest scan showed a little reduction. Hallelujah." And we're all celebrating. Well, of course, the next scan, it didn't stop working. And so the cancer was growing again. So I got thrown out of that. Well, in that period between when I was waiting and when I started and when I was on the drug, two new treatments got approved. A new chemotherapy that had come out of communist East Germany that was sort of their gold standard for treating non-Hodgkin. And then there was a new radioimmunotherapy. My the doctor that I was seeing at City of Hope was against my doing that. He thought I should just go direct to an allo transplant. But of course, I didn't have sibling matches, and there was terrible risk with allo. 1 in 3 patients dies before they even get out of the hospital. So, with odds like that, I was running away from that option. So, I ended up going and getting treated at a third oncology practice in LA, and I ended up doing this new chemo, which was bendamustine, and then we decided we were going to shrink it with this. And then I would go directly to this radioimmunotherapy, which was called Bexar. And I talked to a bunch of patients who had done the Bexar trials and had been in remission for 10 years. And I thought, okay, it's like radiation from the inside out. And I thought, okay, this is my solution. So I also, during this time period, I had recognized I needed to leave my work. So I had stepped down and I'd gone out on leave with the hopes I would get treatment 3 and 4, be able to go back to my, get into remission, go back to work. That didn't quite work out. So had treatment 3, the disease started to reduce, but not to the point where I was in complete remission. So then in the end of 2010, I had Bexar. That was a one and done. And they couldn't image me for like 3 months after I got that. I got that in December of 2010. And I was locked in a room because I was radioactive. They don't do it in the hospital anymore because the insurance wouldn't pay for the hospital room. So I do it at home. I had to stay away from my son. I had to stay away from everybody because I was going to be radioactive for, n number of days. But I said, it's all worth it. So girlfriends were picking up, taking my son to school. They were taking him for play dates after school. So we kind of figured that I had to be in isolation for only 8 days. But I remember being in this room with its own bathroom. Nobody could get near me and doing all of my Christmas shopping that year off Amazon. So that's what I had to do. I can't get scanned for 3 months. So I'm like, okay, this has to have worked. I knew so many people that had done this, and it worked after failed treatments before, just like me. So it was February, and I'm sitting there in the living room of our house. We have a fire going, and a Sunday morning, and I'm having my coffee, and I'm reading my Los Angeles Times, and I'm sitting like this. And I go like this, and I feel these tumors in the back of my neck. Called my oncologist the next day, went in right away. It was already back. It didn't work. So now I've gone through 4 treatments, I'm now 4 years into this and have nothing to show for it. Disease is just as aggressive, coming back. So I went to see the 3 oncologists that had already treated me. And they all said, "Laurie, all you have left as your option is an allogeneic stem cell transplant, which is where you get a donor cells." As I said, I didn't have sibling matches. So I had a lot of risk that I would get terrible graft versus host disease, which happens because basically you're getting another person's immune system. And so you get a new blood type. So like I was AB positive, but if my donor was O, I would end up with O blood type. And what happens is your new immune system begins to reject your old organs. And that's called graft versus host disease. And it can show up in your skin because your skin is a giant organ.
Yep, it's their body's
Yep,
largest organ.
it is. And so you can't even go out in the sun anymore. You can get it in your gut. A lot of GVHD shows up in your gut. So you can end up with Crohn. I mean, terrible stuff, right? So then I'm thinking, oh, great, I got rid of the cancer, but now my quality of life is awful. So I was so depressed. I was so upset. I dropped my son at school. I went to bed and I had sent an email to my close friends and family to let them know what happened. And my girlfriend called, a friend of mine who I'd met through another patient who had the same diagnosis I had. But had been doing a different treatment and appeared to be in a remission. So she called me. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh my God, I'm in bed. I'm so depressed. I'm in my pajamas and I don't know what the hell to do. I guess I have to do an allo transplant." I said, "I got to get up and pick up my son at 3." And she said, "No, Lori," she said, go turn on your computer. So I'm going to come over. We're going to find you a trial." So she said, "You can stay in your pajamas, but go turn on your computer. I'm going to help you find a trial." So she comes over and we email 8 researchers. So there's a guy in Spain doing vaccines for non-Hodgkin. There's another trial going on in Israel. There's something at Bayer or something, so we sent out 8 emails, right? And there's an investigator at UCLA who's got a couple phase 1 trials. So we sent out emails with my diagnosis, the pathology report, my treatment history, the response, everything. She leaves. I go back to bed. And she is hosting a fundraiser that night at a community room in her where she lives in a gated community for the Lymphoma Research Foundation. And I'm supposed to go with my son, which was fine because I was going to go help her set up chairs and stuff like that. Anyway, so I go back to bed and the phone rings. And I pick up the phone and the caller ID says UCLA. And I answer the phone and this heavily accented voice says, "Miss Adami, this is Sven DeVos from UCLA. I just read your email and I need you to come in today because I have a phase 1 trial of a PI3 kinase inhibitor. It's an oral medication." He said, "I have 20 spots in this trial, but I've already filled 19. And if you don't come in today, I have a feeling one of my colleagues is going to lock down this trial." And I said, "Oh my gosh." I said, "Oh my gosh, really?" I said, "You looked at my history. Why are you so encouraged?" He said, "Lori," he said, "I've had these 19 patients. They have treatment histories that look just like yours, and they've had transplants and relapse after transplant, and they're responding really well to this new medication." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Here's the problem. I have to pick my son up soon at school. And then we're going to this fundraiser I have to set up." He said, "Oh, is it the Lymphoma Research Foundation fundraiser?" I said, "Yeah." "Why?" He said, "Oh, I'm going to be there." He said, "I'll bring the disclosures. I'll bring everything. You can sign everything. You can get locked in. And then tomorrow you'll come in and I'll do your bilateral bone marrow biopsies in my office and we'll get started." So can you imagine the coincidence of my
Yeah,
girlfriend?
that's a sign right there if there's ever a sign.
Okay,
No, yeah.
so I was patient 20 in this PI3 kinase inhibitor. It was a small company called Calistoga Pharmaceuticals that had developed this PI3 kinase inhibitor. A PI3 kinase is an enzyme that lives on your cancer cells. And what they do is the pill slowly kills the enzyme and the cancer cells die. So, and it was a whole new kind of paradigm of kinds of treatment, small molecule inhibitors. This was the spring of 2011. So I would be patient 20 in this phase 1 trial. So it was pretty new stuff, but it was better. The risks appeared to be, since the patients had been, some patients as long as a year, some of those 20 patients. So they had some data on side effects. So I started it. And I remember when I met Dr. DeVos, when he saw me, I had these tumors in my face that were so humongous, they were blocking my ear. So when he walked into the room, he's like, "Oh my gosh, I can't even see your right ear. Your tumors are so big." We got started on that, and it was in combination with Rituxan. There were different trial lines, and this was a combination of a drug I'd already had, which was pretty benign. I knew the side effects, they were mild. And so I was in the arm with Rituxan and this PI3 kinase inhibitor, which was called Cal 101. And within probably a week of when I started those pills and restarted the Rituxan, my tumors had shrunk to the point where he could see my ear already. That's how quickly it worked. So amazingly, I was on that drug the longest of any of the patients.
All 20?
Well,
You
they
were the
enrolled a lot more after because
okay,
good.
yeah.
The results were so good that they expanded the cohorts. They moved it into phase 2. FDA approved it right away. Um, so I ended up, as far as the trials were concerned, I was the longest patient in the study. I was on that PI3 kinase inhibitor for almost 6 years. And never got rid of my disease. I still had active disease. It was stable. And I stayed on the pill the whole time. It was waxing and waning, but it never got big enough to where they would throw me out of the trial because they measured certain lymph nodes in my body. I think there were 6 of them. And as long as those nodes were stable and not growing a certain point, I could stay on that pill. And that pill cost a lot of money. It got FDA approved and it was $1,000 a year for that. So a lot of patients couldn't do it because their copays were too high.
Yeah.
You could have out of pocket of 2 grand a month. Well, a lot of people can't afford 24 grand a year for one drug. And, it got approved and Gilead bought the company, and I got it for free for 6 years. Do the math. That would have been
Yeah,
between
no,
2.
that adds
That's
up. That
about
adds
being
up.
a patient on trial. You typically get the medications, the imaging, everything at no cost. So now it wasn't without side effects, which is a whole nother story, which I won't go into right now. But basically, it held me until the end of 2016. And 2012, I attended a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society event where they talked about CAR-T. They showed the film about Emily Whitehead, who was patient number 3 to ever get CAR-T. And I remember watching this film. We were in an LLS event. I was with my husband and my son. And when they talk about taking out my cells and engineering them, I was blown away. I had never heard anything like this before. So it just so happened that week I had a trial visit at UCLA with my oncologist. And I went into him and I said, Dr. DeVos, I said, why haven't you told me about CAR-T? Why am I on this drug that has side effects? Why can't I get CAR-T? And plus that drug with side effects wasn't getting me in remission. It was keeping me stable, but we knew eventually the cancer would probably outsmart it. So he said, come here over the window. And he was now the head of the lymphoma department and he'd move all the lymphoma people into offices in Santa Monica out of Westwood. So he takes me over the window. He says, look at over there. You see those 2 buildings in the distance or like 3-story, whatever. You see those 2 buildings? He said, that's Kite Pharmaceuticals. He said, they are developing CAR-T. They have trials right now, but they're trialing it for the more aggressive lymphomas, leukemias, etc. So they're not ready for follicular. But he said, Laurie, you're on this path. You have stable disease. We're going to ride on this horse until this horse poops out. And then we're going to find you something else to do another. And then it'll come out for trial for follicular. So took 6 years for them to get it into trial for follicular. So I'm merrily riding on this horse, which is now not called Cal 101 anymore. It's called Zydelig. And I'm on this pill. It's controlling my disease. We could feel things were under control. I could always palpate my tumors and we could feel. He had stopped scanning because he wanted to and there was no requirement for me to scan anymore. And we were palpating and we could see that things were still under control because he wanted to give me a break from radiation. So end of 2016, I feel new tumors. Again, I could always feel tumors. I'm out with a girlfriend for coffee and I'm like, oh,
Yeah, doing this. Wait a minute.
you're always doing like this, right?
Yep.
So I call him up. I say, I'm feeling tumors. He said, all right, come on in. Let me feel you. We probably should scan. And sure enough, it stopped working. So I got thrown out of that trial. And then thankfully, a 3rd generation monoclonal antibody like Rituxan had been approved, which was called obinutuzumab. Who names the stuff? Obinutuzumab.
Yeah, I always wonder that.
Anyway, that had been approved. It was like a 10-month course. It was infusions. So I would go in once a month and get started on that. And it was funny because as soon as I stopped taking that PI3 kinase inhibitor, my tumors just went boink, ballooned. So we cleared that out of my system. And the day after New Year's 2017, I started obinutuzumab, which has since been renamed Gazyva. Because that's easier. So, and that was easy. I knew that was just like Rituxan. I had like 80 Rituxan infusions because every treatment I got during, the first 5 years of my treatment came with Rituxan. So I'd had tons of it. Gazyva
Hmm.
would be easy. Anyway, so I did 10 infusions, got my disease back under control, finished the protocol. As soon as the protocol ended, the cancer started to grow again. So now it was just a race. We're now sitting in October of 2017. The tumors are ballooning. I went to see a doctor who specialized in using quad CBD oil,
Mhm.
actual trials in Israel for breast cancer that showed it had a better outcome than chemo for breast cancer. So there was a little literature around that. Dr. DeVos said, that's okay. He said, you just can't smoke it. He said, because there's too much pesticides and junk that could affect your lungs. So he said, but as soon as I started that, bizarrely, my tumors grew even faster. And the CBD, he was an internist actually. He practiced at UCLA for over a dozen years and then started a practice to work on CBD products. And it was interesting because when I was on that drug, all of my swelling, inflammation, pain had gone away, but the tumors just went boing. So I
Yeah.
stopped that and it was just a race against time. So I was out walking and it was like March of 2018. And I get a call from my oncologist, Laurie, I have great news. We're opening a trial for the CAR-T Yescarta product at UCLA. We're going to have 5 slots for follicular, indolent, non-Hodgkin. I need you to come in and execute it, and let's get you going. So that was when, and my tumors were, oh my God, they were like the galloping gourmet. They were like, oh my God.
I've seen the
You've
images.
seen the images. So, and then I also developed a kidney blockage because my cancers were back. My cancer was back. The tumors were everywhere. Guess what? My sinus infections came back. So I had a wicked sinus infection. So Dr. DeVos said, yeah, you're going to have to get rid of the sinus. You can't go in for CAR-T with an active infection. You can't.
Yeah.
I call my ear, nose, and throat. I was seeing a wonderful ear, nose, and throat doctor who's actually the ear, nose, and throat doctor to the LA Kings, and he's a real character. And he'd been caring for me for years after those first schmucks I saw, pardon my French. So
No,
he
no
called me
worries.
right away. He said, "Come in tomorrow. I want to see you." Well, he had a CT scan in his office so he could CT my sinus to see what's going on. So he's like, "Yeah, you're a mess." So he calls in his scheduler. He says, "Okay, Lori, we need to operate on her right away because she needs this life-saving, potentially cancer treatment, and she can't wait. So I want you to clear my schedule for tomorrow. I was supposed to have 2 surgeries. You need to reschedule those patients. Neither one of them is urgent like Lori." And he fit me in the next day. And he ended up doing a major surgery. He thought he was gonna be able to use local anesthesia. He ended up having to use general right in his office. I mean, this guy is incredible. So, I got the surgery. I was good enough. So the doctor just said, okay, let's proceed. Went through all the stuff I had to do. They tried to debulk me. My cancer just went, whatever,
Yeah.
chemo and tried to debulk me. But, my cancer was like, I've seen you before. You're not good.
Not happening.
Oh my God, I had the most wicked cancer. I just wouldn't give up. Anyway, July 15th, I check into UCLA Ronald Reagan Hospital, and July 16th, I got my CAR T cells back.
And this is 2018, right?
2018. So I am now 12 years into this journey with this very difficult refractory follicular non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And I remember the night before I went into the hospital, my son was really upset. He was crying. By now, my son was getting ready to he'd graduated from high school. So he spent his entire elementary, middle, high school with a mom in treatment for cancer. As you can imagine, I have a pretty mature son. He's now 25.
I've
Yeah,
met your
that's
son.
right.
Yeah.
You met August. Yeah.
Yeah. At the Believe
Yep.
Ball.
Yep. So anyway, so 1 month later, they roll me into the PET CT machine and OMG, I am cancer free. The oncologist comes in to tell me the news. He has the report. I crumple it up. I throw it across the room. He said, "Why are you lying to me? Like, what did you guys just type this up in the back room?" Okay, I was still a little bit out of my mind after card.
It's like hard to believe. Like, yeah, your reality becomes like, over a dozen years of negative results and fighting. And it's like, that is your normal. That
Yeah,
is your reality. Like, what is this bullshit you're telling me? Like, for real? Like,
I just didn't believe him. And he's like,
yeah, that's
said,
amazing.
"Okay, well, we're going to image you again in another 60 days, because part of the trial, you had to get images, 30 days, 90
Yeah.
days, 120 days, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever." So my husband comes in after work. He's so excited. And I was just a wet blanket. I don't believe this. And if it's true, it's just going to come back. I was the most negative person you can ever imagine. But sure enough, at my 90-day scan, I couldn't believe it. I was still, and then I was starting.
Still
So I'd
clear.
been on these really intense anti-seizure medications, this awful medication that I wish they would warn patients and their caregivers about. It's called Keppra. And if you Google it, you'll
Hmm.
see very difficult personality changes.
Does sound familiar.
Suicidal ideation, violence, depression, and I was experiencing all of that. And now they put patients prophylactically on Keppra to prevent the worst neurotoxicity because your CAR T cells cross your blood-brain barrier. They're your T
Hmm.
cells. So they go everywhere. And they go to your brain, they can cause inflammation, that can cause seizures, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, so they really need to give patients and caregivers a big warning so then when it happens, they say, yeah, this is the Keppra. This is normal. It will end. And it did end. As soon as they weaned me off the Keppra, I went back to my same old personality. But I was a lunatic. I threw my iPad across the room at the wall. It just goes, oh my God, I hope you
Eh,
didn't break the iPad because I don't have time to go to the Apple store.
It's like, do you have it all backed up on the cloud?
He picked it up and he's like, oh my God, it's still functional.
That must have been in a good
Yeah,
case.
I don't know, but he got lucky on that one. So anyway, and now I'm going on 7 years out. So this July 16th, I have my 7-year anniversary. They no longer image me because once you get to 5 years, they kind of think you're done. But twice a year, my oncologist runs what's called a lymphocyte enumeration report, which shows if you still have no CD19 cells, which was the target, and if you still have no CD19 cells, that means your CAR T cells are still on board. And they just ran mine in January. They'll run it again in July, and I still have no CD19 cells. So I still have CAR T cells on board 7 years later, which is pretty incredible. Now,
That's your lifelong
I
security,
know. And now
right?
when I told you when I was diagnosed, it was always follicular is not curable. Well, now they actually think it is curable with CAR T. And there were 160 patients in the study because the results were so great for follicular that they started to enroll more cohorts of the study, the Zuma 5 study. And now they just presented the long-term data at ASH, the American Society of Hematology conference that was in San Diego in December, and almost 70% of follicular patients have required no additional treatment after their CAR T. So they think it might cure as many as two-thirds of patients of follicular, and follicular is the second most common
That's,
non-Hodgkin.
that's an amazing statistic right there. I mean, two
Show me any
thirds.
chemo,
Shit.
show me any transplant, those numbers. And it's ridiculous because it's still approved as a third line. So patients are having to undergo chemos, which they shouldn't. And the
Yep.
sooner you do CAR T, the more in good shape your immune system is, the better your T cell quality is. And it's crazy. But everybody says, oh, it's so expensive. Okay, excuse me. Look at the cost of an
Yeah. How
transplant.
how much money did you spend in those 12 years before you got it? And
Almost
it's
$3
like,
million, Chris, before I got
yeah,
CAR T.
it's I feel the same way about
Yeah,
Till.
and if I had done an allo transplant with an allo transplant, you're in the hospital for 90 days. Do you know how expensive that is?
Oh God,
And then
that's multiple
said
figures.
when we were talking, because the only option I had versus CAR T was an allo transplant. So he said, well, I would look at it this way. I would say with CAR T, you have a 50% chance you're going to get a complete remission. We haven't lost many patients. Not that many patients have died. You might have tough side effects, but we get you through. But he said with allo transplant, you have a 1 in 3 chance of dying in the hospital in the first 90 days because what happens is the chemo destroys your immune system and you get a secondary infection. You get pneumonia, and then you have no protection and you die. So he said 1 in 3 chance of mortality, 1 in 3 chance only that you'll be cured or that you'll get rid of your disease. And we don't know how long it'll stay away. And a 1 in 3 chance that you're going to have mild GVHD. So chances were, because I didn't have a sibling donor, I was going to have terrible GVHD. And I know so many patients that had GVHD that died because their GVHD attacked their liver and they needed a liver transplant. I mean, compared to that, my gosh, CAR T is cheap and easy, and it's a one and done. So that's my story.
I've like, I think I've known you now for at least over a year. I've heard you tell this short version, long version in person, and I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. And when there's a chance, whether it's, 1 in 3, I mean, or not, like it's still a chance and somebody has to be that
It's like,
chance.
and
And
even looking at my trial, so I did 7 lines of treatment in 12 years, 3 of which were clinical trials, which were by far the best. I mean, look at that PI
you bought yourself time till you could eventually get what you
so
needed
I
to
could get
get. I mean,
CAR-T. I always tell patients, this is not the old days of clinical trials. I mean, some of the stuff that was done to patients, like you look at Tuskegee and some of the stuff, it's
yeah.
not the scary old days. I always push the results because the new stuff is always more targeted. And by definition, if it's going to be more targeted, it's going to have fewer side effects. So trials were a big important part of my story. And look at that PI3 kinase inhibitor. I was on that pill for 6 years.
Was gonna say it kept you stable for all that
I
time,
was the
which,
long tail. Somebody has to be the long tail. When you see when they plot the patients against time and you see as the patients drop off as a function of time because either the side effects they can't handle or the disease comes back. I was the last bar. It's really funny. So I always say, you never know. You always have to have hope. And I was going to say, the night before I went into the hospital for my CAR-T, my son was super upset. Because he knew I'd already had 6 treatments that didn't work. And I said, yeah, but this is different. This uses my cells. This is not a pill or an infusion that comes off a factory line, one size fits all.
yeah, it's not off the
This is
shelf.
my cells modified to include a target that will go after my cancer cells. It's not going to affect my liver, not going to affect other stuff. So, he was pretty despondent at the end. And then a month later, amazingly, in complete remission.
But it's just incredible because you just had brought this up, and the more prior treatments that you do over a period of time that don't work, I mean, there's an actual term, it's called T cell
Exactly.
exhaustion, and that's why both of us are such advocates for getting to a cell therapy like CAR T or TIL, sooner than later because you're not beating your body up so much.
The other friction is they've been doing chemo, stem cell transplant. They've been doing that stuff since the 70s.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's just
50 years.
the protocol that's been done for so
That's
long, and it's what they've
that's
known.
what
It's
like
like they're not thinking out the box
That's
of.
what a community oncologist can understand. That's what they've been doing. They haven't kept up. I mean, there've been so many breakthroughs and new treatments, but if you've been practicing that long, chances are pretty good you don't know about this stuff. So I always encourage patients to see specialists, and a lot of them because they have an
Yes.
HMO. They don't even have a specialist in their network.
Yeah, yeah. There might not even be one in your state, and if it's not in your state, then you gotta travel, and that'll just completely prevent you. So, if you do have an HMO, you don't even start to look if it's out of state, and, it's like, "Well, what do I have?" And even if it is in state, how far away is it from you?
For an HMO or their Medicare Advantage, they can't leave the state if they have Medicare Advantage. So I had a patient in Nevada who had a rare cancer, and there wasn't a single specialist in her state. There were 2 at USC and 1 at UCLA, but the insurance wouldn't authorize her to travel, and she didn't have any money, and she died. They were giving her the wrong chemotherapy, and she died. I know so many patients. So in the
Yeah.
United States, there's a bifurcation between the patients like me who have a great employer who understands and will allow you to go out on leave, who has good insurance, who has good access to specialists. I mean, within the state of California, I could go to 10 cancer centers and see a specialist for follicular, for indolent lymphoma. If you live in Nevada, forget it. And, so I was in that class of people that was lucky I could get trials, and then there's other people who have crappy insurance. I talk to patients who can't even get sick leave. If they don't show up to work, they don't get paid. So
It's just yeah, it's insane because the whole point of insurance is, just in case, when you sign up for it, you never anticipate or expect if you're healthy that you're gonna need it and to what
and the
extent.
Affordable Care Act, I had lost patients who couldn't get insurance because of pre-existing conditions. The Affordable Care Act required that nobody could be denied because of pre-existing conditions. But thanks to who number one term reintroduce junk plans. And so these plans have no protections. And like the Medigap plans, they can deny people with pre-existing conditions again. So we're right back to where we were. And people say, "Oh, it's great insurance." Well, it's very inexpensive, your premiums, but they don't even cover childhood vaccinations. And there's such a lack of awareness. And my gosh, there's so much.
I mean, yeah.
I talk to dozens of patients, so I see people from the gamut, and I've lost far too many patients because there was one person there was a trial at MD Anderson for a pediatric leukemia, but they were in an HMO and their HMO would not clear to travel and their little boy died.
And they, if you're not within that state, I mean, even within that state, you know how long it takes to get from one end to
I
the
know.
other? I think I was looking it up one time. It takes less time to get from the west end of Texas to the east end of
I know.
California than it does to get from, the west end of Texas to the east end of Texas. You know what I mean?
When you're in the Northeast, you can go through 5 countries in one day. If you don't have money, you can't really afford
Yeah.
that.
It all adds up, and so it's like, where's the collaboration? Where's the out the box thinking? Like, it was confusing as shit to me to, having to come figure this out that, between all the different organizations I saw, you have the academic centers, you have your local community, centers, you have your clinical. I mean, there's all these different types of hospital organizations, and to get them to communicate with each other, that's up to you as the patient.
It's where I really encourage patients to rely on nonprofits and get help because, like Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which has funded over $1.5 billion in research since their founding, and they were one of the first to fund CAR-T. Actually, they funded CAR-T at Penn and they funded CAR-T at UCLA, and that became the CAR-T that came out of Penn that Carl June, took to the end, and it became the CAR-T that came out of UCLA, which was Ari Beldegrun that became Kite Pharma.
And that was, so the first CAR T official FDA approval, was that 2017 or was that
It was
2018?
2018. I think it was 2018. No, I think it was 2017. It was for for the diffuse large B cell.
Okay. And then when you did yours in 2018, you
Trial-
were it was a
It was a
trial.
trial, but it approved really fast.
Yeah.
Okay, in my trial, there was a 95% overall response rate, meaning 95 out of 100 patients got
Received some
in
benefit
their
from that.
disease.
Yeah.
And it was like an 83% complete response rate for full.
Which is
The FDA
incredible.
approved right away, but they still only approved it as third line, which is
Which is just sucks because that means you still have to go
because
fail and, you're exhausting your T
if you
cells.
relapse after your first treatment, chances are you're going to have refractory disease just like I did, and you're just going to keep relapsing. So you're much better off doing it at first relapse. But there's just like I talked about these frictions in the system that, there's industry that does chemo and that does transplant.
I would imagine like there's got to be like a current confirmatory trial from your trial that would eventually make it a first line treatment. Like the trial I was in for TIL, it's a second line, but there is a confirmatory trial to
Right.
eventually will make it a first line. I mean, that's got to be the similar
Yeah,
for your CAR T,
and they have
right?
to get costs down to make a first line because there's still enough patients that are
Yeah.
gonna respond with a first line. You need to know that you relapsed after that first line. Now they're doing CAR T outpatient, so they are right there, eliminate or greatly reduce the hospital costs, which is huge. Staying in the hospital
Oh
is
yeah.
super expensive.
It's not
People
comfortable.
please become more and more efficient, figure out how to use growth agents that speed it up so it doesn't take 18 days to make your CAR T cells. It has less human interaction. Potentially, they start to automate more. I mean, we're still in the infancy of this industry. So, Chris, I have a follow on conversation about my life since CAR T, what I've been working on. I've been doing a lot of legislative advocacy. I just testified
I saw you at the Capitol in
and
California.
all my advocacy work. I'm spending about 20 hours a week doing that. So we could talk about this and some more lessons for people to learn about.
100%.
Have a great day.
You too. All right, that concludes today's episode of Till Talks with Chris White as we talk TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, and all advanced cell and gene therapies. As a reminder, I am not a medical professional or medical expert. I am only a professional and expert on my story and my experience. If you are needing or seeking medical advice or assistance, please reach out to your care team. I'd like to thank my guest today for joining me on Till Talks. To our listeners who have not yet done so already, please follow, comment, subscribe, share, and smash that like button. For more information about Till Talks and related resources, please visit www.tilltalks.com. I'm Chris White. As always, sending love to everybody. Peace.